It so happens that I'm here unofficially. I'm here, but I'm not here to participate in an official visit to Indonesia, but to participate in a discussion about freedom of expression and religion involving experts and activists from across South and Southeast Asia. I'm not here either tonight or throughout this week to speak about human rights and freedom of expression in Indonesia in particular, and I wanted to make that clear right at the beginning. But I have to admit that I would welcome the opportunity for a formal official visit to this great nation. Special rapporteurs conduct country visits around the world in which I, in my own role, explore freedom of opinion and expression issues with government, civil society, academics, and others. We can only do so on the basis of invitations from governments, which we seek through formal diplomatic requests. I have actually requested such an invitation from the government of Indonesia, and it is my hope that I'll be in a position to conduct an official visit and deepen my understanding of Indonesia's implementation of its obligations under human rights law in the near future. Tonight, however, I want to talk more generally about the freedom of expression. And with apologies to the vast majority of you who have deep knowledge and understanding of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, I want to do some things that seem rather basic. Eventually we might get, I hope, perhaps in the Q&A, to discussions that get more in depth about freedom of expression, particularly in a digital age. But I want to speak a little bit more generally. So first, what I want to do is say a few words about the underlying law that protects everyone's right to freedom of expression. Second, I will suggest a kind of basic foundation for the law itself. Why did states, after all, agree to protect opinion and expression? What interests and policies does such protection serve? Third, I'll address what I see as the worldwide threat to freedom of expression. And I have to say, it's not monolithic. It's not based on one principle or one kind of threat. It is not only online, but it's offline. It is not only driven by governments, though that is often the case, but it also results from social, cultural, political, and demographic pressures worldwide. I will spend a bit of time talking about content-based restrictions or discrimination, and then I'll talk about the tools used to restrict expression. And then finally, given the threats, I'll conclude with some thoughts about how we might reinvigorate appreciation and respect for the rights to freedom of opinion and expression. And that's where I'll conclude, hopefully on something of an optimistic note. So first, let me talk a little bit about the underlying law. And many of you may already be familiar with that underlying law, but so I would ask for your leave as I give a little bit of a history or a little introduction to what that law is. So when we're talking about human rights law related to the freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, I'm referring specifically to two sets of norms, two instruments. That is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really the foundational instrument in international human rights law, largely aspirational, but it has been converted by and large to a set of binding principles in the two international covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both adopted in 1966. For our purposes tonight, I'm mainly going to be making reference to the ICCPR, right, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Even though its basic provision reflects and echoes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what are those provisions? They're really 3 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs in 2 separate articles of the ICCPR. So Article 19, paragraph 1 of the ICCPR protects everyone's right to hold opinions without interference. Article 19, paragraph 2 protects the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and through any media. I think that is really our fundamental principle for this evening when we're talking about freedom of expression. And let me just highlight those elements of that second paragraph of Article 19. One, it protects the right to seek, receive, and impart. In other words, it protects our right to look for information and ideas. It protects our right to receive those ideas and that information. And it protects our right to express it, to impart it, to share it with others. That's the fundamental element of the right to freedom of expression. It applies, secondly, to information and ideas of all kinds. It's not limited to any particular kind of information. It's not limited to politics or to religion or to cultural issues. It's all ideas, all kinds of information. It's regardless of frontiers. Interestingly, it's a right, unique really, in the International Covenant that applies regardless of one's borders. It allows me to seek, receive, and impart information from any country around the world. And particularly in a digital age, I think that's something that we should be focusing some of our attention on. We'll talk a little bit about that hopefully later and maybe in the Q&A. And then finally, it applies to any media. Right at the time of the adoption of the Covenant and of the Universal Declaration, so we're going back almost 70 years, those who negotiated these instruments already understood that media can change. We wouldn't just be talking about newspaper or radio or television, right? But it would also include things that weren't invented yet, like the internet. Now, we have this right to freedom of expression, and always the question becomes, well, what's the ability of the state to restrict that right to express oneself? And the third paragraph of Article 19 provides the answer there. Article 19, paragraph 3, provides restrictions on expression, but not opinion, and I think that's crucial. Opinion is inviolable. It cannot be restricted in any measure, by any measure, or in any way. But expression, the expression of one's opinion, may be restricted in fairly narrow circumstances, and Article 19.3 says that any restriction must meet a three-part test. And that three-part test means, one, that the restriction must be clear and unambiguous in existing law, right? It can't just be the decision of an executive exercising her own discretion to restrict any particular expression. It has to be based on clear, unambiguous law. It has to be, secondly, focused on a legitimate purpose. And it actually specifies what those legitimate purposes might be, and they may be public health or order, national security, or the rights or reputations of others. But then finally, even if the restriction is in pursuit of a legitimate objective, the restriction must be necessary and proportionate to meet that objective. Now, Article 20, separate from Article 19, provides for restrictions also on incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence, and we may talk about that as well. But those two must be subject to the three-part test that I just mentioned. Okay, so that should be hopefully the extent of my doctrinal presentation. That would be a full class in a law school classroom. So I want to move to the second part of the discussion, which is, what are the underlying principles? Why do we have the right to freedom of expression? Why do we have the right to freedom of opinion? I think it's common for us to focus on the instrumental reasons that we have freedom of expression. And I'll get to those instrumental reasons. But I want to start with the freedom of expression for its own purposes. The freedom of expression as a right that's untethered to instrumental social reasons. And so here is the deep question that philosophers have always struggled with, and which I think freedom of expression is actually rooted in, and that is, what is it that makes us distinctly human? So apart from our enjoyment of reality television, maybe, or cat videos on YouTube, our capacity to reason, right? Our capacity for conscience, for self-awareness, and for reflection is what separates us out from the other members of the animal kingdom, right? Reason and conscience. The Universal Declaration actually celebrates reason and conscience that everyone enjoys by nature of simply being human. And I think that the freedom to exercise that reason and conscience is at the heart of the freedom of expression. How is it possible to exercise reason if we lack information, or we lack access to information? How is it possible to make decisions about our own values, our identities, our preferences, if we lack the ability to debate them with friends and foes alike? How is it possible to form an opinion without freedom to explore in privacy our deepest or even our shallowest curiosities? In short, I would suggest that the freedom of expression at its core is about the freedom to be human, to exercise our most fundamental human qualities of reason and conscience. It is essentially a protection of human dignity. Just as the prohibition of torture protects the body and the mind, and the right to life protects our very existence, the rights to freedom of opinion and expression protect our core human qualities. We're not computers to be programmed by the state. And any attempt to limit the freedom of expression must be understood in this general context. Now, so that's not to say that freedom of expression is only that it's only about human dignity. It's also fundamental to modern human activity, to democratic process and public policy debate, to economic interactions and sustainable development, to scientific progress and the growth of human knowledge, to public health and education, to tolerant pluralistic societies, and the space for nonviolent and understanding discourse. Of course, freedom of expression and freedom of opinion allow for all of those things and are instrumental and essential for us to achieve those goals, those social and political goals. But it's also, I think, at its core about human dignity. Freedom of expression is very much at the core of our modern world, and I would argue that those who resist it and restrict it damage not only human freedom, but their society's ability to enter into and prosper in contemporary life at home and internationally. So third, what are the threats to freedom of expression? So we would not have a protection of the freedom of expression if it were not for the concern of those who actually negotiated and framed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, shortly after the Second World War. I think it's worth sort of reminding ourselves, in a way, about that moment in time when human rights law, when contemporary human rights law was born, right? It was born in the wake of the Second World War. It was born in the wake of a regime, the Nazi regime in particular, that initiated conflict in a variety of ways, but it bears remembering that among the first efforts of the Nazis was doing away with art, literature, and political expression that challenged National Socialist ideology. The Nazi reign of terror actually began with book burnings. It was the death camps that came later. Now, of course, most threats to freedom of expression are not pathways to genocidal violence. And that's not my point at all. My point is that threats to expression are not new, that the people who actually framed the right to freedom of expression as we understand it today understood that freedom of expression would be under attack and was under attack in the past. So today, what marks our world of threats to expression? I want to highlight several, but let me make here first a preliminary remark about threats to expression. I think that most denial of free opinion and expression are about maintaining a particular power structure. Sometimes it's about a person's power. Sometimes it's about a party's power. Sometimes it's about the power and influence of a belief or an institution or a cultural or religious norm. But regardless of the kind of power sought to be maintained, denial of expression has that as its name, the preservation of power. And this power preservation principle, I think, is rooted in insecurity. Now, insecurity at times may be an understandable attitude toward massive changes that modern life can impose on traditional communities, but it's not a legitimate basis for governmental intervention in individual opinion and expression. So how does the denial of freedom of expression manifest itself today? So I think it's useful to highlight a few current problems in two separate categories. And so I want to divide this part of the discussion up between these two categories. The first would be thematic or content-based restrictions on expression. And the second, the tools that impose those restrictions. Now, of course, this isn't always a clear distinction between content-based restrictions and the tools to restrict, but I think conceptually, it allows us to think a little bit about the different threats that are out here. And I do not intend to be comprehensive in discussing these current threats, but I think these will be representative, and then afterwards maybe this will be a launching pad for us to talk more specifically about threats that you see as well. So the first I want to talk about, the first category is content or thematic restrictions, which at some level can be under the umbrella also of discrimination, right? Content-based restrictions are often about discrimination. First, discrimination against vulnerable groups. Restrictions against the expression of vulnerable groups. Examples are legion. I'll mention a few. There are restrictions designed to undermine, for instance, gender or religious expression, or at least where gender and religion intersect, such as clothing or headscarf coverings. So for example, in France, there's the denial of the right to wear a headscarf, whereas in some countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, the headscarf or a form of covering may be imposed. There's ethnic expression, such as education. And there I'm thinking of perhaps the Baha'i in Iran, where they're denied fundamental rights to education and to ethnic heritage, or ethnic expression in one's language, such as restrictions on the Tibetan language in China. There's LGBTI expression, where there's severe restrictions on such expression, and we've seen that over the last years in places like Uganda and Russia and many other places. So these are each discriminatory restrictions on expression, and they're based on restricting the expression of vulnerable groups. Another kind of content-based restriction is blasphemy, right? Laws that restrict the kind of expression that one might direct toward religion. And I think blasphemy laws, which are prevalent throughout this region and throughout, in fact, many regions, and apply to all religions in many ways, do more to undermine minority expression than to protect majority religious groups from harm. And they become a fundamental problem for the freedom of expression, not necessarily because of their intention to protect those who have religious feeling, but because they're generally used in order to restrict the expression of those who have contrary views, views that vary from the mainstream religious attitude. A third area of discrimination in restrictions on expression has to do with opposition political views, repression of dissent. And we see that, again, in this region, for example, in the Sedition Act in Malaysia, which even though the Prime Minister, not much more than a year ago, indicated that he would remove, the government has actually used the Sedition Act to significant effect over the last year in order to really intimidate opposition and to intimidate even artists and thinkers. For example, the cartoonist Zunar, who faces up to 45 years in prison for some of his cartoons which were seen as seditious. There's also the lèse-majesté law in Thailand, but not only a law that provides for restrictions on the things that we might say in Thailand against the king, but also across the region and across the world, there are restrictions on the kinds of things that one might say that would be interpreted as insulting the government. These are content-based restrictions that ultimately undermine public debate. And of course, there's the vast wave of repression of expression in places like Bahrain and Egypt over the last 3 or 4 years. So these are examples of content-based restrictions on expression which, by their nature, are inconsistent with the freedom of expression. Whether they meet the 3-part test for restricting expression is another question, which I think none of these actually meet, but we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A perhaps. So apart from those kinds of content-based restrictions are the tools. What are the tools for restricting speech today? I think these tools generally fall under the category of censorship, but they come in a variety of forms. And the last one that I'll get to is the one that's focused most directly on the information age, as is indicated in the title of the lecture. First, we have denial of access to information. And that could include such things as the blocking of YouTube, which we've seen in Pakistan, or the vast firewall that blocks websites in China, the blocking of social media during protests, such as in Iran during the Green Revolution, or even just over the past year, the blocking of access to social media in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Burundi, just over the last several months. We also see as a form of censorship the targeting of journalists. Now, of course, this past year has shown us the attacks in Paris, the beheadings in Syria, and attacks in Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, Venezuela. Unfortunately, I could go on and on. The attacks on journalists are a kind of scourge across the world today. We also see the jailing of journalists in places like Myanmar, China, Syria, Iran, Egypt, and elsewhere. And we also see it in the lack of protection and attacks on protection of sources of information for journalists, particularly their confidentiality, where we've seen particular pressure in places like the United States. Then there's freedom online. Freedom online, in many respects, should not be seen as really distinguished from, in any material way, from freedom offline, freedom in our regular physical space. It's been said quite repeatedly now, particularly by my predecessor, Frank LaRue, but by the Human Rights Council, by the UN General Assembly, and by many others, that rights offline apply online. It's become a kind of article of faith. And it's true, of course. But I think that even though we see the online world as offering us kind of a vast exponential increase in our ability to have access to information, to expand also exponentially the audience that we might reach with our expression, the online world, the digital age, has also presented governments with extensive and unprecedented abilities to track us, to interfere with our privacy, to interfere with our freedom of expression, and to interfere with our freedom to maintain opinions, actually in ways that are much stronger and much more severe and much more restrictive of opinion and expression than we saw prior to the digital age. In other words, much as we've moved so much of our communication online, so too we've seen that repression has moved online as well. And it's important for us to indicate exactly what that repression looks like. And I would indicate or highlight a few areas of specific concern that I think we should all have when it comes to freedom online. So one is the argument about internet sovereignty. There's an argument going on right now across the world, around the world, that internet sovereignty should be a guiding principle. In other words, that each country should have the ability to kind of decide for itself what its people get to see, how they get to communicate with one another, what they get to communicate to one another. And I think there are two problems with that. So one is there's a legal problem with it, because as I indicated at the beginning, Article 19, Paragraph 2 of the ICCPR, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, protects the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. So to the extent that a state wants to create a wall around its internet, which is the central forum for expression in the world today, they're really acting inconsistently with human rights law, with that ability for us to go beyond our own borders. So that's, I think, the fundamental legal problem with the question of internet sovereignty. But it's also a problem of technology. It's simply impossible for a state today to wall itself off from the rest of the world. And I think we'll see that increasingly. And we see that in China right now, where it's essentially a kind of cat and mouse game when it comes to trying to protect the Great Wall around China's internet and efforts inside to get access to information outside. We see that in all sorts of places. We see that in efforts by different governments to require that all data of individuals is maintained on servers on the territory of a particular state, that websites are held on the territory of that state. I think those kinds of norms, which we see emerging mainly from states that want to restrict access to information, are deeply problematic, and something that those of us who are deep supporters of freedom of expression need to resist and to fight against wherever we can. And the issue of internet governance, which has become an emerging issue and is debated around the world, is something that we need to be focusing our attention on. Separately, there's both mass and targeted surveillance. So just as all of our communication, all of our banking, all of our health information, at least so much of it around the world, has gone online, that's opened up all sorts of avenues for governments both to collect our information in a kind of mass way, right? Just sweeping up all the information that we give, all of the information of our searches. When we do a Google search, it's saved. It's not anonymous generally, although we can get to how you can do that. But all of those searches, all of the information that you put out there is now subject to being held by governments, mined by governments, and you are subject, in a sense, to losing your ability to protect your own privacy. Now, I think that's a deep problem for privacy and a significant problem for freedom of expression. Because once we understand that all of our communications are susceptible to being read and all of our social networks are susceptible to being understood by government, over time our willingness to express ourselves may be undermined, and we may be deterred and chilled from speaking. But I think that just as critical and just as concerning are the kinds of targeted attacks that particularly activists, those who are trying to gain information, those who are seeking to express themselves, particularly those who are seeking to express some form of dissent. And it doesn't necessarily need to be dissent against government. It could be dissent against conventional thinking, dissent against social mores that one simply disagrees with. Increasingly, those people are being targeted and surveilled for their online expression, their online opinion. And I think this is a significant risk for us in the digital age. All of these kinds of attacks, surveillance, attacks on sort of the global internet and the freedom of information, digital attacks on civil society, all of these are aimed at undermining the privacy that's necessary for the exercise of opinion and expression. Now, there are tools to deal with this, and I think the main tools there are encryption and anonymity, right? The ability for us to essentially wrap our communications in a kind of cloth so that no one can read it except your intended recipient. I put a lock, I scramble my data, my email, or my search on a website so that only the website can unscramble it, or only my intended recipient can unscramble it, can unlock that information. That's one way that we can protect ourselves, at least the content of our communication. The other is anonymity, and there are tools to maintain our anonymity, whether through virtual private networks, VPNs, or through use of such tools as the Tor network or proxy servers. These are going to be critical tools in an area of both mass and targeted surveillance and digital attacks. They're going to be critical tools for activists who need to really access information in an environment where that information is withheld from them. And states need to be told that they should not restrict those tools. So running through much of this, I think, is a completely failed attempt to justify restrictions. There's a failure, one, to provide open and transparent process of lawmaking. There's a failure of substantial overbreadth and vagueness in restrictive laws themselves, giving vast discretion to authorities to restrict speech without constraint. There's deeply inadequate judicial control over these restrictions. And then there's the disingenuous use of permitted grounds for restrictions, such as national security, to repress speech. And this disingenuousness is something that we need to fight against repeatedly. And by fighting, I don't mean taking up arms. I mean we need to resist that disingenuousness and really require states, when those states restrict speech, when they restrict opinion, essentially, require them to justify those restrictions, to specify the necessity for the restriction, and to justify whether the restriction itself is proportionate. And I think all of these are risks that we're facing today. So I'm going to conclude with a little bit of a focus on this region, on Southeast Asia, and really just suggest, because I don't think there are obvious or neat solutions for any of this, but there are at least 3 things that I think could be done within this region to improve the status of freedom of expression. One is states should follow the lead of countries like Indonesia and ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Ratification is critical for states both to participate in the development of human rights law, but also it's a signal of their intention to be bound by human rights law. And not all states in the region have ratified it. Secondly, there needs to be a broad process of national legal reform on all of these issues. And it needs to focus not only on ensuring that the restrictions that are imposed on expression meet that three-part test under human rights law, but that states go through and determine where they have content-based restrictions that are inconsistent with human rights law, whether it's sedition or blasphemy or other discriminatory types of restrictions. And then third, I think for the long term, the region, and by the region I really mean ASEAN countries, should be aiming towards a kind of regional forum to protect freedom of expression. Now, by that, I mean really a reference to other regions around the world where regional mechanisms to protect freedom of expression and to identify problems in the implementation of the right to freedom of expression can be identified very early. So there's a special rapporteur on the freedom of expression in the Inter-American system. There's one in the African system. There's one in the European system, in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Over the long term, I think it's going to be critical for there to be a national, a regional mechanism for ASEAN countries as well in order to address all of these issues. So I want to conclude on a kind of hopeful note, I hope. So for all the threat and the risk to freedom of expression today, I think we also live in an age that's pretty remarkable in its sort of fullness of information, of media platforms, of ideas, of images, of sounds that are really accessible to all of us in this room. And they cross borders and they inform global debate. And I believe that the digital age especially provides the tools and the environment for opinion and expression well beyond what humans have known in the past. It also, unfortunately, provides the tools for repression, and that we're going to have to fight tooth and nail. But I believe the power of free expression will win out if we maintain the same commitment to freedom of expression that those who negotiated the Universal Declaration did almost 70 years ago. So with that, thank you, and I would welcome your questions.